Thank you so much for tuning in to our conversation with Annie Duke. I just want to introduce Annie. She is an author, a corporate speaker, and a consultant in the decision-making space. Annie's latest book, How to Decide: Simple Tools for Making Better Choices, was released in the fall of 2020. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It is a great book that talks about how to make decisions, and it also is set up as a workbook so that we can all practice and improve our decision-making skills. Her previous book, Thinking in Bets, is a national bestseller. During her career as a professional poker player, Annie won over $4 million in tournament poker and won a World Series of Poker bracelet. She retired from the game in 2012. Prior to becoming a professional poker player, Annie was awarded a National Science Foundation Fellowship to study cognitive psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. Annie is the co-founder of the Alliance for Decision Education, a nonprofit whose mission is to improve lives by empowering students through decision skills education. Annie's book, Thinking in Bets, when I read it a few years ago, it really resonated with me, thinking about high-stakes decision-making in an ever-changing environment with incomplete information. And to top it off, in a place where there's poor feedback loops. And that, to me, is such a parallel to backcountry skiing. And since then, spending time with Annie's work and doing more reading, this book and these concepts have really changed how I look at decision making, how I teach it as an instructor, how I think about things as a guide and as a backcountry traveler. So this work has been really impactful. I'm so excited everyone can join us on this day for a conversation with Annie Duke. We're going to roll right into it. I apologize. We're going to jump in about 2 to 3 minutes into our conversation. We had a couple issues with recording. But what I asked Annie initially is understanding the parallels between backcountry skiing and poker. Can you walk us through decision making at a high stakes poker game? And here's where we start.
We can think about, for example, like in what you're doing, it's like you can't look underneath the snow to kind of know what's going on there. You have to sort of make guesses on that based on the things that you can see, in the same way that I might have to at a poker table make guesses at the cards that you're holding based on the way that you're acting, which should sound pretty similar, right? We're trying to make guesses about things that we can't see based on the things that we can. And we're trying to make those connections and model that out, because the better the model we have of our opponent, whether it's an opponent at the table or the weather, or what the snow is like, or what the conditions are like, we can think about those as opponents. The better we can model that, the more predictive they are, and the better we can stay out of trouble. So that's kind of the base problem, is that we've got these two forms of uncertainty. Now, as we step back from that, what we understand is that the real problem comes from this, that we have an intuition that as the world changes, in other words, like as I proceed through a hand of poker and I start, new information starts to come into my view, as it will, right? Like those luck elements will reveal themselves. I'll start to see the cards that are coming. The hidden information will start to reveal itself, because my opponent will be doing things that are going to give me better information about their hand. Mm-hmm. They're going to be raising, they're going to be calling, they're going to be acting timid, they're going to be acting strong, all these things. That as that information comes in, I'm going to step back as if I'm a rational actor. And I'm going to reassess the situation. And I'm going to make great decisions about whether I should continue in the hand or not, whether I should change course, whether I should get out of the hand, so on and so forth. That I will process that new information in a rational way and go on from there. But that's really where the rub is that we don't. We just don't. And so one of the things that actually separates great poker players from merely good ones, separate and apart from just the skill, how good are you at modeling that situation, which comes with experience, right? Like you can read the conditions better than another person, is that the really great ones react to those conditions that they're reading more rationally than the ones who don't. And the problem is that when you add uncertainty and when someone isn't giving you a perfect answer, that's when all of the bias can get in. That's when you can be reading the environment that you're in order to suit your purposes. You can be convincing yourself that you need to get your losses back, that you don't want to have wasted the time that you've already put in, that you want to get the money back that you already have in the pot, that you're actually winning a hand that you're losing, all of these things. And the reason that we can convince ourselves of those is because we do have so much latitude because of how much uncertainty there is, right? Like in chess, it's hard for me to convince myself I'm winning a game.
Yeah.
But in poker, that's not the case. And so that's really where we need to step back and say that it's a twofold problem. How do we, first of all, get better at actually understanding the situation that we're in? That's problem number one. Mm-hmm. But problem number two is, how do we get ourselves to act more rationally given the situation that we're in? And that's actually a second order problem, which is a really huge issue.
Yeah. Yeah. And it really makes me think a lot about, you know, avalanche accidents of, you know, the biggest accident I was caught in, we saw issues. We didn't want to speak up. We ended up in this place where with any other person, we wouldn't be there. And so we see the same thing in the world of snow and avalanches. And I wonder, in terms of your research and your experience, are there ways that we can build in triggers in the heat of the moment to pull us more into that rational mind?
Yeah, so there absolutely are. So let me just say, I really want to hit this point home, that we have the intuition as decision makers that when those signals that would be obvious to anybody looking in from the outside appear, that we will act rationally in the face of those. That's the intuition that we have. Mm-hmm. But we know that that's not true because people stick to things too long. Like, just think about, like, this is actually a story that I'm writing about right now, but if you think about Into Thin Air, right? Like Rob Hall, one of the most experienced alpinists in the world, he understood what a turnaround time was. In fact, he didn't just understand it, he said it. And they blew past that turnaround time that year, like it didn't even exist. So, and this is someone who, if anybody should be knowing better, that's the person who should know better. But there were all sorts of forces working against him, actually reacting well in that situation, not the least of which was he felt he had an obligation to the people who were with him, right? And what ends up happening is, we can sort of think about two things, is that you could think about a lot of decision making as kind of a street fight between the present you, what you want right now, and the future version of you who would look back and say, this is what I should have done. And you can see that, like with the Rob Hall decision, right? Like, he's got present you, I want to get my people up to the top of the mountain. But that's not actually good for any future version of those people, right? Like, if you're blowing past a turnaround time, it's actually bad for the people that you're guiding. So you can see that it's a battle, what's bad for them now versus what's bad for them in the future. And in that situation, the thing that we need to understand is that generally the present wins. Mm-hmm. Okay. And like, we can step back and like look at that in like the simplest way. Like, I want to eat healthy, but there's a cupcake sitting in front of me. All right. Like, the cupcake is pretty strong. It's going to do pretty well in that battle. Right. Yeah. So, okay. So this is the problem that we have, is that we know that we tend to prioritize the things that we want right now over what's good for us in the future. That's kind of problem number one. And problem number two is we have an intuition that we don't need to really do much about that, because obviously when signals come in that we should quit, we will do so. Okay, so we have this twofold problem. But what we know is that second piece isn't true. Mm-hmm. We don't actually react well to signals that are coming in as they come in. So this happens in poker, where, you know, I raise because I'm pretty sure that somebody's going to fold if I do so. And then all of a sudden they call, which should be a big blinking signal that I was wrong. But then I just sort of rejig and I convince myself that they're calling with a really weak hand. And they actually, it's the same hand I had them on that they were willing to fold. It's just they're not smart enough. And I tell a story, right? And there's this wonderful way that I can tell a story that I should continue. Right. So I convinced myself that I wasn't wrong about the hand they were holding. It's just that they're acting differently about the hand than I thought. And actually they are weak. And all of a sudden I've lost all my money. All right. So this is kind of what happens. Okay. So this gives us a little bit of a clue as to how we might solve this. And it's to say there's a big difference between the way we think about a decision in the moment versus both the way we think about it, if we could time travel to the future and look back and say, what should I have done in that situation? But also, if we're thinking ahead, we're about what should we do if we get into this situation. In other words, as long as we're separate and apart from the moment of deciding, we tend to do better. Mm-hmm. So there's a couple of things you can do in advance. And one of the best ways to figure out what it is you should do is to do what's called a pre-mortem. Mm-hmm. So what is a pre-mortem? Well, so mostly what happens is like an avalanche happens and then people spend time trying to figure out what happened, what went wrong. But by the time you're at what went wrong, people are injured or they may have died or bad things have happened, right? And so we're trying to sort of like figure out what went wrong, but you're doing it after the fact. So it's already kind of too late. So a pre-mortem says, let's try to figure out what went wrong, but before it actually happened. So prior to going out, you say, okay, let's imagine that we got caught in an avalanche. And everybody does this separately. So you get some people to do this together as a group, and you say each person should write down the top 3 to 5 reasons that we got caught in that situation that have to do with our own decision-making. Mm-hmm. And the top 3 to 5 reasons that have to do with luck. So luck is just things that are out of your control. Yeah. Right. Now, the reason why you want to separate those out is that when it comes to bad outcomes, people will tend to focus on the things that have to do with luck. And so if you allow them to kind of freeform this exercise, they're going to come up with all sorts of unlucky things that happen. Yeah. Right. So we actually want them to focus on both, right? What's the decision making that occurred and what are the unlucky things that happened? Now, by the way, on the flip side, you can do something called a backcast, and you should do these things together. And a backcast is, let's imagine we went out and we didn't get, nothing bad happened. Yeah. Right. What are the top 3 to 5 reasons that have to do with our own decision-making? What are the top 3 to 5 reasons that have to do with luck? So now the reason why, again, you want to divide it is now we get the flip. When we go to the good side of the coin, everybody talks about their great decision-making and nobody talks about the luck element that made things better. All right, so that's why we want to set that up together. Now, this allows you to create what I call a decision exploration table. So now you can imagine a 2x2. You've got pre-mortem on the left and backcast on the right. Those would be the columns. And then you've got your own decision-making or skill, and then things outside of your control or luck. Okay, so those are now the rows. And now everybody has filled that out. You now bring those all into a central place, have everybody do it separately, bring all the answers into a central place, and then you have a discussion. You figure out what are the same answers, what are different answers. And now you just fill out your table. Here are the things that we think can go wrong. Here are the things that we think can go right. And basically now you look through those and you do a couple things. One is you say, if we know that our decision-making can go wrong in a particular way, what are the things that we can do about it in advance? So actually a turnaround time that you stick to is a really good example of that. And it's quite simple. It's quite similar to in poker, we have stop losses. Mm-hmm. So essentially what we say is, I know that in the moment, my decision-making isn't going to be particularly good. So because in the moment, my decision-making isn't going to be particularly good, I'm going to decide for myself way in advance. What is an acceptable amount of money to lose here? And if I lose that amount of money, I just get up because I know I'm in danger of convincing myself that it's just because of luck and I'm actually playing really well and things are actually okay, or that kind of thing. So the first step is to set what those pre-commitments are. What are the absolute lines that we should not cross as we're looking at those decisions that we might make that would help us avoid those bad decisions. And those are lines that we're not going to cross. Now, you want to set them, but then you also want to stick to them. So you need to make sure that everybody knows about it and everybody's held accountable to it. Mm-hmm. Right. So that's number one. And then number two is on the luck side of things. you want to say, look, we can't control the luck, but we can do two things, and we can decide these things in advance. The first is we can figure out how we're going to react if the bad luck happens. So just have a plan in place in advance. But the other thing you can say is, what are the early signals that might be out there that would tell me that this bad luck is going to occur? Because sometimes you can sort of see in advance, right? Like there are signals in advance, but when we're in the moment, we tend to ignore them. So by having identified them in advance, it allows you to actually hold those in mind and say, and essentially it's when we see those signals, we'll exit.
Yeah.
Right. So,
yeah.
So we could think about it two ways. One is we're thinking about, no matter what the situation is, this is a hard and fast rule about when we'll exit. You can think about it as like circling a time, for example, or a date on the calendar or something like that. Mm-hmm. And then the second piece, because this is the luck element, is when the environment is in this state. So when the environment has changed in a particular way and it's in this state, we will exit.
Yeah.
Now, the thing that you cannot do is say, when the environment is in this state, or when it is this time, we will step back and we'll reanalyze our decision. And we'll think about it because we'll have all this other stuff in place, and now we'll make a brand new decision and we'll decide then. Because every bit of science tells you, you will not make a good decision in that situation. So that's why you really need these hard and fast rules. Basically, and you can think about it this way. There's a circle a date on the calendar strategy, or circle a time on the calendar, or basically when this occurs in the environment strategy. And those are the two strategies that you would want to apply. Does that make sense?
It does. And it really rings true. What we've been talking about lately in the avalanche industry is closing terrain before you walk out the door. So in this day, given these conditions, these are the places we won't go. Mm-hmm. And making sure it's done while you're drinking coffee in your slippers in the comfort of your own home. Because, we don't always make those great decisions. We get out there and it's great powder and we want to keep going and it's so fun. And so it really rings true in terms of.
Yeah. So I love that idea of like closing off terrain as well. Like if we know that we're going to make bad decisions about, once we're in it, one of the ways that we might fail is to go places that, had we thought about it in advance, we wouldn't go. Then think about it in advance and shut that part of the world off for yourself. Just make it not an option. So I love that, because that's an example of what we call a category decision. Mm-hmm. So a category decision is like, so here's a category decision. I'm a vegan. All right. So I am actually vegan. So that's a category decision for me. So I've shut off terrain to myself. Mm-hmm. So, and what's nice about that is that I don't, when I'm approaching what I want to eat, I don't have to make any new decisions about it, because I'm not saying things like, what most people do is they'll say things like, I probably don't want to go into that terrain today, which would be kind of the same thing as saying like, I'm trying to eat fewer animal products. Yeah. Well, the problem when I say that is that basically every time I'm now faced with a decision about a meal, I have to make a brand new decision about whether this is the time that I eat animal products. Because I'm saying like, oh, I'm trying to be more plant-based, right? Like I'm trying to be more plant-based. So, and what will end up happening is that, like I just said, the steak is going to win. Yeah. Right. So, because I happen to be a vegan, but I also happen to think steak is really yummy. I just haven't eaten it in decades. But I remember steak and it's delicious. Yeah. I just like to say that for the record. I think steak is delicious. So I just can't eat it. So I know that if I'm faced with, if I'm saying I'm trying to eat a more plant-based diet, that the problem is that when I'm faced with that steak, I'm not going to see that decision in the aggregate, right? Like it might be fine this one time, but if I make that decision repeatedly, what does that do to my goal to be more plant-based? And the answer is not a lot of good, because the steak is probably going to win. So the example that you're giving is a really good one of basically you're saying I'm a vegan. In other words, these are choices that are unavailable to me. Yeah. And I am not actually allowed to take them, as opposed to when the weather's bad, these are the areas that are more dangerous, and I probably shouldn't want to necessarily go into them, which is a really different way to think about it. And it's not, it sounds subtle, but it's not a subtle difference at all, because in that situation, you're now making a new decision and it's a judgment call.
Yeah.
And in the judgment call, as you just said, the desire to keep going, the desire to, you know, continue on your path is going to win. And you may be fine that day, but when you think about that decision in the aggregate, it's, you're almost guaranteed to not be fine on one of those times, which is why you want to make that category decision. So, and then one thing that I love about category decisions and these ideas of like, have a stop loss, have a stop time, right? Like these kinds of things, like what's happening in the environment, what time of day is it? Those kinds of things, is that it gives you a second order way to essentially be right. And the reason that I say that is not because I don't believe that like we should be putting our ego aside and so on and so forth. It's that everybody has an ego, and I can tell you all you want that you should put it aside, but like we can sort of get better at it. But in the end, we're all trying to push that self-narrative that we're, you know, that we're competent, we're good, and we're good decision makers, and so on and so forth. And one of the problems that we really face is that when we do go out and we're faced with that choice to turn around, that's when we say, well, why did I go out in the first place? I failed. This was a bad decision to be here. All these things that make us feel like we've lost, right? Like, but if you keep going, you haven't lost anything yet, because you still have the opportunity to recover the day or recover the trip. If you keep going, it could work out okay. Yes, I'm 3 hours from the summit of Mount Everest, but if I keep going, maybe I can make it. And then I won't have lost. I won't have lost this effort and this time and everything that I've put into this expedition. And I won't have failed the people that I'm with, because I will have gotten to them to the top. So that's kind of a first order way of thinking about it. But when we set these category decisions and these stop losses and these stop times, it gives us a second order way to be right, which is really good if you communicate to the people that you're with, where you say, this is what really good decision making is about. We're all going to be held accountable to this. And it's not just about getting to where we're going. It's about making the best decision given where we want to go. And sometimes the way that we're going to win is by actually turning around. And that's going to be the win that we're going to get, because we're going to have done something incredibly hard for a human being to do, which is to turn around when there's nothing obvious going on, when the snow isn't actually coming down on top of you. That's one of the hardest things a human being can do. So when you can turn that into a win, that you're doing something so difficult for a human being to be able to do, I think that's when you really start to get into great decision making. Does that make sense?
It does. And I really like how you frame it, because we talk a lot about the influences of, we call it the human factor. And one of the big influences is commitment. So going out, having a really specific goal, we often expose ourselves to more hazard than if we're like, oh, we're going to go out and see what we see, and these things are off limit. And so it really rings true to then shift the conversation of, and these are the other ways that our day is successful.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's interesting what you just said about goals, because so one of the pieces of what I'm writing about is actually about the downside of goals. So goals in general tend to be kind of pass fail.
Mm-hmm.
You either do it or you don't, right? So that would be like getting to the top of Everest. That's a pass fail goal. If in some ways getting within 300 feet of the top of Everest is worse than not having gone up at all. Because if I don't go up at all, I didn't fail to do anything.
Yeah.
But if I get within 300 feet, I failed. That's weird, right? Because by the way, getting 26,000 feet in the air, it seems like a pretty big win to me, even if you aren't on the tippy top. So goals have, first of all, this pass fail nature. So once we set a goal, what happens is that I imagine you've probably heard in what I'm talking about, that a lot of our bad decision making occurs when we're what Daniel Kahneman would call in the losses, meaning that we're losing, but we're like losing in theory, And it wouldn't be until we exit the situation that we would actually be losing for real. So let me give you like the example in poker. I could be in a hand that if I play that situation over and over again, I'm going to lose all of my money. But until I've actually quit the hand, in other words, until I've decided to fold, I haven't actually lost the money in that hand. There's still a chance I could recover it. Right. But we know that even when things work out, it doesn't necessarily make it a great decision. So I'm chasing the hand in order to try to not abandon the chips I already have in it. Because as long as I keep going, I have the hope of ending up with a win. But that's an isolated, I'm thinking about that in terms of a hand. But if I thought about doing that over and over again, I would lose all my money in the long run. Right. Eventually things would go really poorly. So that's kind of what I mean by like in the losses, that you're in the losses, but you haven't turned around yet, or you haven't lost yet. So when we set goals that are pass fail in nature, we kind of set it up that we're immediately in the losses, meaning we haven't reached our goal yet. Yeah. And now all the tailwinds are going to be toward finishing, and all the headwinds are going to be against good decisions in the face of obvious signs that you should be turning around.
Yeah.
Right? Because we set a goal, which is I want to get to place A, right? Or I want to accomplish this today. So that's one of the problems with goals. And then the other problem with goals is that they naturally are kind of myopic. They privilege certain values that you have over others. So, obviously, like, for example, like with what you do, you're sacrificing comfort.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's fine. Because that's part of what you do, but then that can go too far. Like you could be experiencing horrible pain, but because you have this goal to continue on, you ignore the pain, which if it's sort of throbbing, that's fine. But if it's acute, it's really bad that you privileged in that sense, the goal over the health. Right. But that's kind of what we do. And then it tends to be pretty binary, and we don't think about that in degrees. So setting flexible goals that basically are like, what if, and having category decisions, like where are we going to go? Where are we not going to go? What are the conditions under which we would turn around? That all creates a lot of flexibility around the goal, and it removes the pass fail nature of the goal itself and redefines what it means to make a great decision.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like that. And it makes me think of, we have borrowed some concepts from all over, but for one place from wildland firefighting, and they talk about margin with your decisions. So meaning, do you have room to make an error and still have it not be catastrophic failure?
Yeah.
And I wonder if that sounds like maybe that's part of the conversation.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And that's the kind of thing where when you're doing those premortems and you're looking at what comes out of it, that's exactly the type of discussion. Like, how much margin do we have here?
Yeah.
Right. Like, how much leeway are we going to give ourselves in this decision? What is the area within which we have the ability to use our judgment in the moment? And what are the areas that are just it's not a judgment call, it just is. Right. So when you're saying like, there's territory we won't go to, there's territory you won't go to. And then I assume there's something in the middle, which is there's territory we'll go to under particular conditions. And it's our judgment about what those conditions are, but we're setting out what those conditions are in advance. Yeah. But we have there's margin in there.
Yeah.
Right. And then these are the areas we would always go to.
Yeah.
Right. And so you can always, obviously things are up for a judgment call. So as an example, I happen to be a vegan, and I also don't eat processed sugar, but I allow myself to use my judgment on the weekends about that.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think that's kind of similar. So, and in poker, you actually allow yourself that a lot. There's certain things that you will and won't do, but then there's things that are on the margin where you're sort of trying to read the situation and try to figure out what you want to do in those situations. But the key there is that, you define for yourself what the possibilities are. So again, it's still constrained. It's not like every single choice is available to you, but there's certain choices that are available to you, and you understand you have movement and margin within those to decide how exactly you want to execute in that particular situation within the choices that you already have for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, that rings really true, because the other piece of terrain, we talk about closed and then we talk about open, meaning I can go there unless I see obvious signs of instability. And
Right.
then we have standby. I need more information. And what information do I need?
Right.
So that's, yeah, absolutely. And I'm wondering if, do your strategies around decision making shift as the stakes change? Like if you're playing high stakes poker, are you using different strategies versus lower stakes? You know, for us, if we're just out noodling with our friends, not in very committing terrain, should we be adapting decision making styles compared to when we're in really high consequence terrain?
So I have an answer to this, but let me just answer the poker part of it.
Okay.
Poker, the money that you're playing for is inconsequential. So people think about the stakes as changing because of the amount of money that you're playing for, but that's not true. Whether you're playing for big money or small money, any decision you make is actually the same stakes, because you could be playing for matchsticks, right? It's like, in that sense. That being said, there are some decisions in poker that are within the game, bigger stakes decision than smaller stakes decision, regardless of whether you're playing big money poker or small money poker. It has to do with the nature of the hand that you're playing.
Mm-hmm.
So let me explain what I mean. The way that we think about how much should we be putting into the decision that we're making has to do with the type of decision that we're facing. And basically we want to think about, is this decision one that is a high threshold decision, meaning the threshold before which we would say, let's do it, is higher than other decisions that we would make. And the way we figure out what our threshold is supposed to be is two things. One is, what's the impact of getting this thing wrong?
Mm-hmm.
And how reversible is it? So let me explain, first of all, what the threshold is. So decision making can broadly be sort of dumped into two categories, right? There's the sorting process and the picking process.
Yeah.
Okay. So sorting is looking through my options and I'm trying to decide which ones satisfy the requirement that past which I would be willing to choose it.
Okay.
So think about like a menu, right? So for me, I'm looking through the menu and I've got two big requirements. I'm a vegan and I don't like eggplant. Okay. So I sort of sort the menu out that way. Here are the things that like don't satisfy something that I would be willing to eat. Here's the stuff that does. So that's how I get something over the threshold. So that's the sorting process. And then I can think about the picking process would be picking among the things that are past the threshold. Right. In a hiring process, you can think about the sorting is, let me think about what I want for the person in this role. I'm going to interview a whole bunch of people. And then I'm going to whittle it down to a particular number of options, among which probably if I picked any of them, I would be okay. So the sorting is find the people that meet your threshold for someone who you think would be good in the position that you're hiring for. And then the picking is choosing among those people who have passed the threshold.
Okay.
How we decide how high we want to set that threshold has to do with the impact and the reversibility of the decision. What do I mean by impact? Well, when we set a lower threshold for a decision, what that means is that we're spending less time and we're being less precise in that sorting process, which means that we're probably reducing the accuracy of the decision that we're going to make, which means that we're increasing the probability we might get a bad outcome. That's really the end result of that. Is that we're just increasing the probability we might get a bad outcome. So the question we always want to ask ourselves is, what's our tolerance for getting a bad outcome?
Yeah.
Right. And we're thinking like bad outcomes of the usual sort.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's important. Bad outcomes of the usual sort. Okay. So how can we figure that out? What we do is it's a little pre-mortemish. In other words, it involves some mental time travel. So I can do it with you. Like, let's say that so we all know people who are really get hung up on the picking part of the puzzle. So they've got the restaurant and they whittled it down. Maybe they're not a vegan and they're choosing between the chicken and the fish. But obviously the chicken and the fish have met their threshold. These are things that I would like. And now trying to decide between them, they've asked every single person at the table, and they've called over the wait staff, and they've asked that person, and they're madly reading Yelp reviews. And then the wait staff comes over to take everybody's order, and they say, pick me last.
Yeah.
Right. And you're just like, okay. So obviously that person is living in fear that they make a mistake and they make a bad choice. But I'll ask you, so let's imagine it's a year from now. And I see you and I say, hey, Sarah, we remember when we had that meal and you ordered the chicken, and the chicken was like super dry. It was yucky. You were pretty sad that you ordered it a year ago. But now it's a year later and I'm seeing you and I say, hey, remember that chicken you had a year ago? How much did it affect your happiness today?
Almost none, or not at all.
I hope not at all.
Very insignificantly.
If your dry chicken a year ago affected your happiness today, we have other issues to talk about.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so now let's move it up and say, I see you in a month.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Still.
I see you in a week. By the way, you had 21 meals since then.
Yeah.
Right. So what we recognize is that this decision that you're taking so long on this picking process, how do I choose among the options that are already pretty good for me? Actually is of little import at all. Like even if you get a bad outcome, it's not going to affect your happiness at all, not even in a week. So that's one of the ways that we can sort of get to, how much time should we be spending like setting these boundaries and doing all this stuff. It's like, well, given where we're going, what's kind of the worst of the things that can happen, right? And if that happens, does it really matter much? And the thing is that you shouldn't have like, somebody falls and like breaks their ankle, because that could happen literally anywhere. That's not unusual for the choice that you're making. I just want to be clear about that. This is something that's going to be caused by the fact that you went to this particular place, yeah. Right? So because the broken ankle or whatever, that's just a matter of luck, right? Like that could happen skiing anywhere. It could happen cross country skiing on like the most solid terrain, whatever, things like that just happen. So it's okay. So if we're going to go to this place, when we think about like the bad things that happen, are any of them particularly impactful? Right. And if the answer is no, you don't need to set all these turnaround times and like, we should do this and whatever. You just say, here's the terrain we're going to, we're not going to the rest, and we're not going to think too hard about it. Yeah. Because there's no reason to. Mm-hmm. Right now, that's one thing. The second thing is how reversible is the decision. Yeah. Right. So there's a really big difference between being helicoptered into somewhere and then things going south. That's pretty hard to get out of. Mm-hmm. Right. Like that's a hard thing to extricate yourself from, versus somewhere where you can actually exit the situation really easily. And the more reversible the situation is, in other words, the easier it is to quit and get out of it. In other words, when I'm thinking about these things like, well, if it's 1 o'clock, can I actually leave? Yeah. Right. Can I actually turn around? If I see that there's bad clouds off to the west, like, can I actually get out of it? The more the answer to that is yes, the less strict you need to be, the less you need to be thinking about that decision, because you can actually extricate yourself from the decision more easily. So we want to think about reversibility. Mm-hmm. And we want to think about impact. Now we can take that a step further. And what we can say is, given that we know that, we can actually use that in order to start to gather information. So this is a poker concept. So there are, like, for example, in poker, I'll make a lot of little small bets because your reaction is going to help me to tell me what kind of player you are. So they're small bets. So if I lose them, it's not a big deal. It's a fair value in exchange for the information that I'm going to get. Because I've got very little money in the pot, it's very easy for me to quit the situation. So if you react in a way that doesn't look favorable for me, I can just fold. So it's super reversible, low impact. And I do a lot of that in order to try to find things out about you. Okay. So one of the things that we can start to do is discover things about ourselves and our own preferences, but also the terrain, by going and figuring out, if we go out and we use this model to say, we're not sure what's going on, let's go to a safer, lower impact area to try to test the conditions. Mm-hmm. In a situation where we know probably nothing really bad is going to happen to us. It's easy for us to get out of it. And we're going to gather a lot of information that's going to help us make better decisions about the more impactful, the less reversible decisions, the ones with consequences that are way worse. Mm-hmm. And you can actually really intentionally stack those in front of each other. And then that starts to reframe your thinking, which is what is the thing that I can do that would get me the most information at the least risk, where it's the most reversible. And now it like changes the way that you actually think about even gathering the information. Yeah. Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, it really, all of it overlays a lot with what we talk about in terms of snow and avalanches, of looking at the terrain and figuring out how consequential it is, and how confident you are in your assessment. And the less confident I am, the wider the margin, the more information I want to be able to gather in a lower consequence event. So yeah. I feel like it ties in a lot with that margin piece of, if I have very little margin, I need to have a lot of certainty, versus if I don't have a lot of certainty, I need to have wider margins. And how do I build that in?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the thing is that like once you sort of realize that the options that you have in front of you have all met a threshold, you should really be flipping coins, and you should save time on those situations, and you should spend your time on the more consequential situations. So like, what do I mean by that? Like, if you think about it, like if you've narrowed it down to the chicken and the fish, I'll just use that as a simple example. If chicken were my only option, would you be happy? Well, I wouldn't, but whatever, fake chicken. Would I be happy? If let's say the answer is, obviously I've narrowed it down to 2. So my answer must be yes. If the fish dish were your only option, would you be happy? My answer has to be yes. So I call this the only option test. So once you have things that pass what are called the only option test, by definition, that means that you're done with sorting. It means they've already met your threshold. Mm-hmm. So once you're in the picking process, you shouldn't spend any time choosing between them. You should just flip a coin, because the whole thing that's slowing you down on those decisions that are less impactful is the worry that you're going to get your chicken and it's going to be dry. But the thing is that without a time machine, and we don't have a time machine, this is the whole problem we have as decision makers. We all need time machines. We do much better, but we don't have a time machine. So the information that you're looking for is unavailable to you, because the information you're looking for is to actually taste the dish, and to know, so you can know. Mm-hmm. And the thing is that you can't. That's the whole point. So and that, like, so we can take that, this thresholding issue in the only option test. Like, if I'm hiring an intern, that's pretty low impact if it doesn't work out, and it's pretty reversible as well. So my threshold is going to be pretty low. And once I've got some options that are above the threshold, I'm not going to sit and debate it forever who I should hire. I'm probably just going to like take a voice vote and go with whatever the answer is. Because I mean, it's the same as flipping a coin. It doesn't really matter. But if I'm trying to hire a CEO, mm-hmm. now that's really consequential. It's really hard to reverse. It's an expensive choice. My threshold is going to be much higher. So in order to get somebody who would pass the only option test there, that I'm putting a lot more time into the sorting. Yeah. But even so there, if I have 2 candidates who do pass the only option test, even if it's for a CEO, it's harder to get there. But even then I would still flip coins. Yeah. So that's the key, is really think about, like, there's sorting and there's picking, and spend your time on the sorting. And don't stop spending so much time on the picking, because the reason you're spending time on the picking is you're trying to defend against getting a bad outcome, but that's just luck. Yeah. Right? Like, your chicken was dry, whatever. That's just bad luck. I don't know what to tell you. It's like you twisted your ankle on the easiest terrain ever. Like that, it's okay. Yeah. You can't defend against every outcome that's ever going to happen to you, right? Like, sometimes you lose a hand, even though you made pretty good decisions. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. And that brings me to another topic that was really impactful reading your books is that concept of resulting and looking back on your decisions. And, with avalanches, we look back on our day, and if we just went powder skiing and nothing happened, oftentimes people will say, well, it was a great day, versus if you trigger an avalanche, it was a bad day. And I found your vocabulary and your commentary on looking at decision-making quality versus outcome quality, that really impacted us and as a community. And I was wondering if you could just
talk a little bit more about that for.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me talk about a little bit what the resulting problem is. So, I mean, I've talked a little bit about it when it comes to a chicken dish, right? Like you get bad chicken and you're immediately like, that was a mistake. That was a terrible decision. So that's actually a pretty good example of resulting.
Yeah.
So here's the problem we have as decision makers. Whether it's avalanches or a hand of poker or a policy decision that the government makes or whatever, is that decisions are complicated and they're complex. And pretty much any decision you make is going to be deeply into the world of subjective judgment, meaning that there isn't an objectively, I mean, if you were omniscient, there would be an objectively best answer, but you're not omniscient. There's all sorts of information that's hidden from you. There's all sorts of things that you can't see or you can't know. And even if you could know those things, there's still luck, right? So as an example, I could know 100% of the things that I need to know about a coin. So I could know that the coin will flip heads 60% of the time and tails 40% of the time. I could know that for 100% sure. So now I've even taken away the hidden information.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, if you say to me, do you want to bet on this coin? And I know for a fact that this coin is 60% heads, 40% tail, I should call heads every single time.
Yeah.
But it's going to land tails 40% of the time. So resulting is when it lands tails on that 40%, I said, what a stupid decision. I lost $1. Right? Well, no, it wasn't a stupid decision. The coin was 60-40. So of course I'm going to win 3-2. I'm going to win 3 times out of every 5. Yeah. Right? But I happen to have observed the time that it landed tails, and I use that to say, oh, that must have been a terrible decision. Now notice, if you can do that in a situation where you have all the information that you need, mm-hmm. Imagine what happens when you can't see the coin. Now that problem gets really bad. So when we get into these situations where understanding why something occurred is really complex because we'd have to dig into the decision quality in a way that's actually really opaque to us, we take this shortcut. It's just a shortcut. If I know the quality of the decision, there was an avalanche, there wasn't, or the outcome rather. So I know how it turned out. Mm-hmm. Then I will use that to know whether the decision was good or not. And it doesn't matter. Is it football? The ball was intercepted. It must have been a terrible play call. Game-winning touchdown. What a great play call. Mm-hmm. I won the hand. I must have played it poorly. I lost the hand. I won the hand. I must have played it great. I lost the hand. I must have played it poorly. They got caught in an avalanche. They must have done something stupid. They made it through just fine. They must have made great decisions. And the thing is that none of those things are true because decision quality and outcome quality are actually related in 4 different ways. You can make terrible decisions. You can go out into the worst conditions ever, where the underlying snowbed is like as shifty as possible, right? The weather's terrible for the conditions. No sane person would ever go out into that terrain on that particular day. And you can get through just fine. You come home, you're safe. Okay, so that's a terrible decision that gets a good outcome. So that can happen. You can do the same thing and you can get caught in an avalanche. Okay, so that's a terrible decision that has a bad outcome. So let's think about those 2 things as one, let's call it like just desserts, right? You made a bad decision and something bad happened.
Yeah.
Okay, just desserts. Like I went through a red light, I got a traffic ticket, got what I deserved. But then you can also have just dumb luck, right? Like I made the worst decisions ever. I was stupid. I should never have been out on that terrain, but nothing bad happened to me. Okay. So that's dumb luck. But then we have the reverse. I can make the best decisions ever, given what my risk tolerance is, because that's always a question, right? Like for me, my risk tolerance is I wouldn't do what you do.
Yeah.
Right. So, but given that you do what you do, you set very clear risk tolerance as opposed to, in terms of how much risk you're willing to take on. And assuming that you've acted within that and you've made great decisions, you can still have something bad happen to you. So let's call that bad luck, mm-hmm. right? Or you make great decisions and great things happen. Let's call that an earned reward. So we can think about those 4 ways that decisions relate to each other. Now, when we do resulting, we forget that there's 4 ways that decisions relate to each other. We only think about 2 of them. And what we say is like, things went fine, I must have made great decisions, or things went horribly, must have made bad decisions. And the problem, of course, is that we're going to take really bad lessons from it when we treat the world that way. So when people get through these things just fine, then they start to think that those decisions are okay. Even though it's, you know what, it's a lot like the donut, right? If I'm trying to eat healthy and live a long time, if I eat 1 donut on a day, probably nothing bad is going to happen. I'm probably not even going to notice it on the scale the next day. If weight is what I'm worried about, if I'm worried about my blood sugar, I'm probably not going to notice it. In a week, it's probably not going to affect my blood sugar. So nothing obviously bad happens in that moment, but the accumulation of that decision over time is really bad, right? So, but because I felt fine and my pants still fit the next day and, you know, whatever, I may say, oh, you know, this is a totally good decision to make because nothing bad is happening to me.
Yeah.
But then, you know, over time, obviously it's going to be terrible. And it's not until I accumulate that decision over time that I'm going to see that that was really bad. So what happens is that like someone goes out and they get a little bit riskier. Maybe they go into terrain they really shouldn't be going into, or they go out in conditions that they shouldn't, or they ignore turnaround time or whatever, and they get home just fine. And now all of a sudden it's like, well, I guess that was fine. I guess I misassessed the risk. And the answer is no, you didn't. It's that when you make those decisions, there's some probability of certain things happening. And even if the probability of nothing bad happening to you is 10%, 10% of the time, nothing bad is going to happen to you. And it's really bad if you then assume that the decision-making that led up to that must have been good. And that's what we tend to do. And likewise, somebody can get caught in an avalanche. Someone can have something really bad happen to them where actually they did everything right. Because whenever you go out there, there's risk. So assuming that they understood what their risk tolerance was and they went through a pre-mortem and a backcast and they thought about what are the signs and signals and what are the turnaround times and everything like that, it's tragic. But it doesn't mean that you would then change what you do. So what we instead want to do is 2 things. One is we really want to take the time to record the decision in advance. In other words, we want to think about what are the expectations that we actually have for the world? What are these sort of stop losses that we're putting in place? That could be a stop time or a stop condition. What are the no-goes? What are the category decisions that we're making? And you're doing that in context of a very well-stated risk tolerance. This is the risk that I'm willing to take on. Okay. So the more that we can write that down, the more we can not be a resulter, because we can always look back and we can say, well, how were we thinking about this decision? What was the quality of what we were thinking about? Then you can do a second thing. And here's the second thing that you can do. What was the information that revealed itself after the fact? Now, the fact that there was an avalanche is that's not helpful, because that's just like a time machine issue, right? But if it's, oh, well, there were certain things about the terrain that actually kind of revealed themselves that would have signaled that that might have happened. And I think there's a connection there. Now you can get some learning out of it. You can say, okay, new information revealed itself after the fact. And your job is to say, could I have known about that beforehand? Now, a lot of times the answer is going to be no. But when the answer is yes, then it's not about beating yourself up for the past decision. It's about saying, okay, now that this new information revealed itself and it turned out that was something I could have known beforehand if I'd known that information was important, how do I now include that in my decision-making process going forward? So everything becomes a forward look as opposed to beating yourself up on the back end. Because if you start to look back at decisions and beat yourself up for them, that then exacerbates the problem of resulting in the first place, because you become so afraid of it that you can actually go the other way and become incredibly risk averse, which you also don't want to do. That's also an error, particularly in the kind of thing that you do.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because we try and encourage people to debrief every day after the end of the day, since you don't get the feedback from your environment. And one of the questions that we ask is, did we make good decisions or did we just get away with it? Or were we good or were we lucky? And it sounds like perhaps we need to shift that question of, what information could have revealed itself beforehand, or what did we miss that will cause us to change our behavior in the future?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think there's two things. One is make sure when you're thinking about did we make good decisions, to say, when we look at the decisions and the things that we committed to initially, did we stick to those things? That should really be what the question is. Then the second question is, when you're making those decisions, particularly when you're talking about like premortems and backcasts, you're saying that you believe that things will be true of the environment that you're in. So you're making predictions about what the environment is going to look like. So then you can look back and you can say, how good were our predictions about what the environment was going to look like? Mm-hmm. And that becomes about getting a better predictor, right? Yeah. So when the environment doesn't line up with what you predict, and that's whether it's worse or it's better, mm-hmm. It should be irrelevant to you whether the conditions are better, but much better than you expect, or much worse than you expect. In both cases, it's not what you expect. You should say, okay, so let's think about our prediction. Why were we predicting that the environment was going to look like this? And what could we have thought about that would have helped us to be better predictors of that? Because that's going to help you predict going forward, right? So you have some prediction about what the terrain is going to look like. If the terrain is different to the good or to the bad, you should be paying attention to that and trying to close that loop. And that's going to get into what's the information that revealed itself to us. Right. And is that something that we could have known beforehand so that we could be better predictors of that going forward? And the thing is, a lot of times, I just want to be clear, a lot of times the answer is going to be no. We can't know till we get there. And as long as we're thinking about what the possibilities are and we have a plan for those possibilities, we're fine. Mm-hmm. But occasionally the answer will be yes. There is something that we can know when you have this particular snowfall pattern leading up to it, when you have these particular temperature changes. It affects the environment in a particular way. So we're going to hold that as a hypothesis now, and we're going to include that in the set of possibilities going forward.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And while you were talking about that, one of the other things you were talking about is a known risk tolerance. And I was wondering, because the other thing that really spoke to me about some of your writing was talking in probabilities rather than absolutes. Mm-hmm. And can you use that probabilistic thinking and language to develop risk tolerance? Does that make sense? Or to establish your risk tolerance?
Yeah. So basically, so this is what we want to think about. When we're thinking about a particular option that we're considering, the world isn't deterministic, meaning it's not... While when you look in retrospect, the things turn out one way or the other, when we're actually thinking about the decision in the future, they don't turn out one way or the other. There's several possibilities as to how those might turn out. So the first thing we want to do is try to identify what the possible outcomes are, and then try to forecast the probability of that occurring, right? And I know that seems really scary because it's like, well, how could I possibly know if it's 20%? But the thing that I want to say is that you're already doing it. So whenever you make a decision, implicitly, you're saying, here are the set of possible outcomes and here are the chances of those things occurring. We don't like to actually make that explicit because it's scary, because we sort of feel like it's a test and like there's a right answer. But remember, we're dealing with things that are subjective. So you're not trying to get to a right answer. You're trying to get to your best answer. Mm-hmm. And just leave it at that. Like, I'm trying to make my best educated guess, and the fact that I'm trying is better than not trying at all.
Yeah.
Because again, you're doing it anyway, so you might as well do it explicitly. Okay, so you have your set of possible outcomes, and then you have some probability of those occurring, and then you divide those up into essentially upside and downside. So upside is, here are all my good outcomes. Downside are, here are all my bad outcomes. And now your risk tolerance is going to be, what's your tolerance for those bad outcomes? Yeah. Right? How willing are you to tolerate those? Which is going to be you really probing yourself as you go through those. How much can I tolerate any of these outcomes, right? So for some people, for example, the possibility of death is just intolerable. So their risk tolerance for anything that could increase the chance that they die would be 0.
Yeah.
But I know that's not true for you, because you go out and you do things that increase the chances that you die all the time. Yeah. But you should try to say, how much tolerance do I have for that?
Yeah.
Over what my normal risk is on a given day. right? And try to quantify that for yourself and think about that separate and apart from a given decision that you're making, and say, when I think about what the bad outcomes are that could occur from me going out into the back country, what are the bad outcomes that can occur? What is my tolerance for those bad outcomes occurring? And let me think about that separate and apart from deciding on a day.
Yeah.
Right. And figure that out. What's the probability of death? Like, am I okay with that? Right. Because that's the thing that's not reversible. I would just like to say that that's completely not reversible. And then some of it may have to do with like how reversible it is. So getting caught in really bad weather, it's like, well, how easy is it for me to get out of the situation? The easier it is for me to get out of this situation, the more tolerant I should be of that. Right. So you want to think about it that way, but try to decide those things in advance. And then when you enter into a decision, you should make those probabilistic forecasts and see if it lines up with what your risk tolerance is.
Yeah.
And then if it does, the fact that you got caught in bad weather, it's not a bad decision that you went out, because you included that. Obviously you can have bad things happen to you. You included that in the calculation.
Yeah.
And you were within what your risk tolerance was. And so, okay.
Yeah. I really like that framework in terms of where the risk tolerance fits in with what we do on a daily basis. Yeah.
So great. Sadly, I have to go. I'm running a little bit late for my next thing, but
all right.
But this was so super fun.
Yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time. And do you want to just tell our crew where to find you, our audience?
Sure. Yeah, you can go to annieduke.com. Okay. You can also go to @AnnieDuke on Twitter. I'm a little bit active there. I'm not super active, but I'm pretty active. I have a newsletter that you can sign up for at Annie Duke. At annieduke.com. You can find videos of me speaking. If you want to find my books, you can figure out how to get to them there. The two books are How to Decide and Thinking in Bets. I've got another one coming out in the fall of 2022. I don't know if you could figure out what the theme of it was, but it should be pretty obvious that it's about when do you quit things? When do you turn around, right? Because that's a lot of what we talked about. So I'm super excited about that. And hopefully we can keep in touch, because this was really fun.
That would be great. Yeah. Thank you so much. I really
Moving on to my next thing.
All right. Thank you so
much.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.